Ontario police say they have broken up a human trafficking operation that forced
Marky
43
Dow was
Mexican
19 when
immigrants
she
to
was
work
trafficked.
for very
Her
little
parents
pay.
were people
Our
she
team
thought
joins us now
emotionally,
with the details.
they're
Now
controlled
she
through
has this
violence.
The victims
to
were
vulnerable young
transported
girls
daily
and women.
at a given time to work as cleaners
They are
at a
confused
hotel and
they're unsure of
vacation
what
properties
next steps
located
are.
in
That fear
central
of the unknown
and eastern
is really
Ontario.
real.
You've seen the news reports. Human trafficking is a heinous crime that violates the basic concept of human dignity. Though numbers are difficult to tally, it's estimated that traffickers are robbing a staggering 24.9 million people of their freedom. Canada Border Services Agency, the CBSA, is the enforcement arm of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, and in working with local police and the RCMP, has conducted several crackdowns of cases of human trafficking of foreign migrants into Canada. But what is the fate of women and girls trafficked into Canada for sex trade or forced labor once they are rescued by authorities or their traffickers have been reported? Many of the victims brought from outside Canada have no legal immigration status, but will returning them to their countries of origin place them once again at risk, and is the risk of being deported keeping several victims in hiding from authorities.
In some cases, some people feel anything's better than back home.
Many of the international cases, they know that the authorities in their countries are not the most pure. They are afraid to come forward.
Cambodia is very unique because it's going to take probably a couple of generations for the society to build up those social structures again that support victims of human trafficking.
In a June 2019 Trafficking in Persons report by the U.S. State Department, the United States and Canada are among the few countries which meet legislative standards for anti-human trafficking legislation and prevention. But the TIP report also shows the vast majority of countries and regions internationally do not comply with even minimum legislative standards to combat human trafficking or are not making significant enough efforts to meet them. With some regions still lacking the legislation to protect women and girls, could a rescue by CBSA or the RCMP end up in a ticket back home to further victimization? I spoke with Cassandra Smith, who is the harm reduction coordinator at Black Cap, the Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention. She spoke to me about the more insidious means of trafficking that abusers use to exploit women and girls from African, South American, and Caribbean countries.
We see it happen a lot among family and close friends. So let's say an older sister's here or an aunt, and she has a husband who has a great job and they have a house full of kids, and she's like, look, I need some help. I have a cousin back home or my younger sister and she's not doing nothing, so let me get her out here, and they're living in substandard conditions and they're literally the hired help. It's not that random stranger that's sending for you. How do they know how to get you? Who's investing in your ticket, in whatever costs that are involved in getting you here? It's usually a family member. So if it's not a family member, it's a potential spouse. So it's someone who knows someone else. Oh, so-and-so, you remember her? She has a nice son. He grew up now and he wants a wife. And by the time he's not the same little boy she knew. He's up here. He obviously feels like he has a sense of power and dominance over her because of the status situation. And that abuse of power also takes place. And it's money as well. Sorry to say, people are looking for the easiest ways to make a lot of money. And when they look at drug trafficking, the running from the police, buying product, competition, all of those other factors, they find it easier, unfortunately, to traffic people.
The Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention works with women involved in the sex trade who have no legal status and also helps find interim subsidized housing for victims regardless of their illegitimate immigration status. Latoya Brown is a social worker with Black Cap and a survivor of Toronto's sex trade. Now she works with women, educating them on safer methods of sex, distributing protection from STIs as well as birth control. She talks about her first-hand experience with trafficked non-Canadian women used in massage parlors, hotels, and strip clubs.
I was 17, I think, or 18, something like that. I started in it because I need to support myself and my daughter and stuff like that, pay my rent. I did come from a single mother home, I used to work like strip clubs and the spa, which was just rub and tug before, and I could leave, like if I worked at the spa at night, I could leave between $1,000 to $2,000. In the strip club, you could leave with $1,000 to $3,000 or more. Girls that were trafficked in, they mostly worked in spas, because really, like some spas, you don't need your license to work, so it's easier to escape or not communicate with people than if you're in a strip club. There's a lot of girls, there's a lot of people to communicate with. The last time I was in a spa, I know like you sit in like a living room, like you just sit there, watch TVs until like, we call them tricks, would come in, and then you'll walk, they'll pick you, and then that's the only time like you're interacting with someone other than the girls that are there. What are they, like Syrian countries and stuff? Like you'd have a lot of those girls in the spas. But like the club was like mostly white girls. And then you'd have some Asians that they'll come, they'll work for a bit, and then you don't see them again. So that's how you know that they weren't there legally. Like they just came and then they're gone. They'll smuggle the girls in, like bring the girls in, have them work, and then send them back or something.
Harm Reduction Coordinator Cassandra Smith explained that for women who managed to escape their traffickers, some would find their way into the shelter systems.
For those who've escaped, usually they hide in shelters. They know that all female shelters are a safe space. Through whatever dialogue they have had, they've learned about the shelter system. So it's usually their entry point into accessing support services such as Black Cap and other spaces. There are a lot more human trafficking victims in the shelter system than the city knows of.
But even with managing to escape and find shelter, fears of being deported might make non-Canadian victims of trafficking hesitant to access social services.
They're afraid of being sent back. They're afraid of being judged, and they also don't know that there are protections. There are ways to keep them safe.
Organizations like the FCJ Refugee Center work with victims and advocate for legal immigration status of the victims. Lolly Rico, a part of the FCJ Refugee Center's anti-human trafficking team, herself a refugee from El Salvador, knows the dangers women face if they are deported back to the countries from which they were trafficked. Lolly works with immigration lawyers to get the women into the refugee determination system, which may offer them protection in Canada.
When Immigration Canada implement the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, the new act that was in 2002, already were one component about trafficking, because Canada was one of the leader countries on to put the convention, the Palermo Convention against human trafficking. And we were, through the Canadian Council for Refugees, we start doing a kind of coordination and to start pushing to have something to protect them. And what happened is that many of the international cases, they know that the authorities in their countries are not the most pure and less corrupt law enforcement. They are afraid to come forward, because they are afraid that if they are deported back, most of the time the traffickers, they know where they live and they can continue threatening them. Or they are afraid to go back because they feel shame, or in their country they don't have any kind of support for victims of human trafficking, and they can go traffic again, not in Canada, but going to another country. And in that case, they don't want to leave at that moment because they have a lot of fear.
But despite provisions made in Canada's Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, in Lolly's experience, very few human trafficking survivors are successful in making a refugee claim.
It's a very small number. The majority of the cases, they don't go through the refugee process because they don't have a refugee case. They go through other process like humanitarian compassion grounds.
According to the Canadian Council for Refugees, many trafficked persons don't meet the very narrow refugee definition set out by the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And making a claim also, in some regards, offers less access to social services than if the IRCC offers victims a temporary resident permit. And even if victims make an application for permanent residence on humanitarian and compassionate grounds, HC applications have very long processing times and do not place a stay on deportation, which means a victim can be removed from Canada even before their application is considered. To give some perspective on what trafficked victims may face in countries lacking proper legislation, I spoke to Radanak International's Executive Director, Graham Illman. Radanak International is a Canadian faith-based organization that works on the ground in Cambodia in rehabilitating and repatriating victims of human trafficking. But much of Cambodia's current infrastructure and its historical conflicts have left the country vulnerable to trafficking.
I can comment from a Cambodian perspective because Cambodia is a very unique climate to work in, just because of, I don't know how much you know of Cambodia's history in the last 40 or 50 years, but it's pretty brutal. Just with the influence from the Vietnam War and the rise of the Khmer Rouge and the genocide that happened back in the late 70s. So all of that paints Cambodia into a very unique picture as far as, the cause of being very vulnerable to trafficking, and then how do you fix that? Because it just made the country so vulnerable because everything during the Khmer Rouge era was decimated. Like all the social structure was basically dismantled systematically by Pol Pot, and so that's what gave rise to Cambodia being so vulnerable for trafficking, both domestically and sadly internationally as well. So that's why Cambodia is very unique. Like there's trafficking issues, obviously that's a global issue, but Cambodia is very unique because it's going to take probably a couple of generations for the society to build up those social structures again that support victims of human trafficking and help them to be rehabilitated. What we usually say to people here is that when a young woman from Canada is trafficked, that's still obviously a very terrible thing, but we have social structures in place that can provide proper rehabilitation, all those kinds of things. It's not perfect, but it's way further along than a developing country like Cambodia that's been through what it's been through.
Illman also explained Cambodia's lack of anti-trafficking legislation also left the country vulnerable to sex tourism, where vacationers from other countries with more stringent laws would visit Cambodia with intentions of taking advantage of its unregulated sex industry.
Donald Baker was another huge case here in Canada. He was another guy from this area who was traveling all over Asia abusing kids. Donald Baker was the first person convicted under what was then new legislation in Canada, basically for sex tourism. And so the legislation came in. The tourism basically, if you're using your passport for sex tourism, we can try you in this country as if the assault happened here. These guys prey on the countries that they know that the laws aren't there, right? So you could take 2 flights to get into Cambodia 10 years ago. You could take a taxi from the airport, and from research online that there's one area that we're familiar with that was at the time particularly for pedophiles, and you walk in and you can have your choice of kid. Like it was that easy.
I hoped to find a non-status victim of sex trafficking who could tell their story, but the search proved difficult in Toronto. Stephanie Amores, who previously worked with Radanak International, explained that the city's recent crackdowns and regulations have driven Toronto's sex industry even further underground.
It is a lot harder to find them because they aren't on the streets as much anymore.
Yeah.
The problem is a lot of them, anymore, really, especially because of this law, but even before the law went into effect, most illegal activities, you would just be shocked maybe to hear this, although you might already have discovered this fact by now, but it goes on in suburban Canada and America. Your next door neighbor who has the 2-3 car garage, nice house where they just pull up in their SUV, that's where all the brothels are now. And it's going on, people order girls to their home. It's not strip clubs and massage parlors anymore, and so it's just happening so much more surreptitiously now, and so much harder to find and track down, and you can't just barge into your neighbor's house.
In speaking with CBSA investigators, the uncertain status of foreign trafficked victims has proven problematic, as witnesses are at risk of being deported before their traffickers can be fully investigated for prosecution. And while the question may be asked if it's logistically possible to offer amnesty to all foreign trafficked victims who end up in Canada, the lack of guaranteed safety or regularization of non-status victims may be a contributing element, keeping international human trafficking alive and well in the shadows.